David Cochrane, that Marco Mendicino will be the chief of staff for Mark Carney. So, but we don't know at this stage whether or not that is going to be part of a transition period or a permanent move as well. We know that Marco Mendicino certainly was a former public safety minister, and he said he would not be seeking re-election, left the party over a disagreement really when it came to foreign policy.
Incredible. Marco Mendicino, you remember him? Former public safety minister who wanted to use tanks against the Freedom Convoy. And of course, Mark Carney wanted to use tanks. Incredible. This guy wasn't even running again. Now he's going to be in the inner circle of Mark Carney as the chief of staff. When I come back, it's going to be a bumpy ride with Mark Carney. We need political change, but we also need the resolve to resist. Yes, please like the station and give it the thumbs up. We do beat the suppression that way when you share it with your friends and family. And subscribe. We are setting a goal for 50,000. Not next week, but in the next 2 or 3 weeks. We can do it with your help. And thank you so much for the support you've shown of late. We really appreciate it. And I promise today we're not going to have extended videos of Mark Carney. We will see him very briefly, but not extended videos. You know, I said we're in for a bumpy ride. And we thought it was, I hope you didn't think it was over with Justin Trudeau. Of course, you people are far too smart.
Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy night.
It's going to be a bumpy ride with Mark Carney. I can guarantee you that. Before I get into, I thought was one of Pierre Poilievre's best news conferences yesterday. And I'm not going to say, yeah, boy, he sure got that woke reporter. Well, what Pierre Poilievre needs to do, of course, is to talk to more conservative media, like the station here and others like myself. But sure, he has to come against the mainstream media. He's more comfortable putting down the mainstream media than apparently he is having a discourse with like-minded conservatives. But yeah, I think he'll come around, and we have to hope and pray that he does. But Pierre Poilievre is getting there. He's getting back again. He's getting back. He's finding his voice again after using Justin Trudeau's voice for too long. And he needs to stop talking about standing with Ukraine until the end of time. And if he can't tell Canadians that it's time to stop pouring billions of dollars into the black hole of Kiev, then he needs to just stop talking about Ukraine. He needs to stop threatening President Donald Trump, because antagonizing Trump only angers Poilievre's base, and it does nothing to move us closer to a federal election. Which, by the way, Alberta Premier Daniel Smith, whom we will be discussing much more of in this broadcast, again said yesterday, let's have a federal election soon. That was her reaction to Mark Carney being elected as Liberal leader and soon to be Prime Minister of Canada. Now, Poilievre can only talk tough against Donald Trump. He can't deliver, and God knows he probably doesn't really want to. But the more he talks like he's going to get Donald Trump, the more he helps Justin Trudeau. Poilievre does need to keep talking about how Mark Carney is a globalist hypocrite. He has the bona fides, the way Justin Trudeau was a hypocrite about his misogyny, about his racism. Carney was a globalist hypocrite who ran a company called Brookfield Asset Management that paid virtually no tax, although Carney thinks you should be paying lots of tax so the government can invest your money in its myriad of projects. And Brookfield was heavily invested in fossil fuels across the world, in pipelines across the world. But Mark Carney wants nothing to do with fossil fuels in Canada or pipelines in Canada, because that might help you. That might help the Canadian economy. Brookfield Management's making enough money, thank you very much, outside of Canada. It doesn't need the Canadian market. And that's it. Carney claims to despise fossil fuels. He's making millions off of it. His company has made millions off it. Poilievre does need to keep talking about how Carney may claim to be a top economist and banker, but his words betray a comprehension of the economy on par with an eighth grader. He does not need to repeat how Carney doesn't. He does need to repeat how Carney thinks steel is not a irrelevant commodity to the Canadian economy. So these are all of the things Pierre Poilievre needs to keep talking about, and hopefully he will. Now, I just want to quickly, before we get to Poilievre, this is astounding. Look at that. 99% of you think the Liberal leadership race was rigged. How could it not have been rigged? And look at this. And I'll have Ezra Lament on the show on Thursday, and we'll be talking about how small C conservative media should be handling all of this trade crisis, tariff crisis right now. But Ezra commented on this yesterday and said it was completely impossible for Carney to win every Liberal riding, through all 383 Liberal ridings, and get, according to this, it's not just 80, it was 87% of the vote. And poor Chrystia Freeland didn't even get got barely 7% of the vote, not even 8%. And Gould and Poilievre way at the bottom there. So, this is what we're up against with this corrupt Carney regime, which hasn't even technically been installed yet. But, wait for it. It will be very soon. Now, let's compare Poilievre here. I think this is one of his best news conferences in a long time, because he focuses on Carney's hypocrisy.
Just like Justin, and he's more of the same. We have the same Liberal MPs, the same Liberal advisors, the same Liberal promises, who will produce the same Liberal results. Doubling housing costs, doubling the debt, doubling lineups at food banks, enriching the global elites at the expense of the working class, and making our economy more helpless and reliant on the Americans than ever before. Now, Mark Carney is trying to hide from his record over the last 5 years of advising Trudeau in favor of raising carbon taxes, money printing inflation, and blocking resource projects, all while he moved his company headquarters and jobs to the United States. It's ironic. Mr. Carney is trying to distract from his many scandals and conflicts of interest, as well as his disastrous record as Justin Trudeau's economic advisor, by talking about Trump. He's the guy that sold out to Trump. 6 days after Donald Trump threatened Canada with tariffs to steal our jobs, Mark Carney announced to Brookfield shareholders that he would move his headquarters from Canada to New York. And when you asked him about it, he lied to your face. We got it in writing, and we proved it. He sold out Canada. He put his profit ahead of our people. And he did exactly what Donald Trump wanted. Never before have we had a prime minister so conflicted and compromised, and yet so little scrutinized. Just like when he supported carbon taxes in Canada while investing in American coal. He opposed Canadian pipelines while his company bought Middle East pipelines. He has millions of dollars of financial interests that run against Canada's national interests. He gets rich making Canadians poor. You can be sure about one thing. Donald Trump's going to have a briefing on his desk of all of Mark Carney's American investments. We need to break our dependence on the Americans by building east-west pipelines. We need more interprovincial trade. We need to unleash our free enterprise system to reverse the helplessness that the Liberals have caused over the last 10 years of tax and keep it in the ground extremism. More than anything, we need to bring back the Canadian promise. In a country where we trade with each other, we produce our own resources, we build homes for our people, we protect our weak and vulnerable while standing up to the Americans abroad. The Canadian promise is that anyone from anywhere can achieve anything. That hard work gets you a great life.
What instructions have you given your caucus members and your candidates about wearing MAGA merchandise or using MAGA slogans?
This is a very nervy question. So you can't wear MAGA merchandise or MAGA clothing. Now, Poilievre's answer is so-so, but it's better than it could have been.
Well, my instruction is that we should put Canada first. We want to put our country first, stand up for our country against both American aggression, but also against the destructive liberal policies that have made us helpless and reliant on the U.S. I have also made it clear to my members of Parliament that we should favor bringing jobs back to Canada, not move them to the United States of America as Mark Carney did when he had the chance.
You still think we're going to have a carbon tax election, considering Mark Carney says he's going to scrap the consumer one?
We are going to have a carbon tax election because Mark Carney has proposed to add another industrial carbon tax on top of the existing one. In days, Donald Trump could impose tariffs on Canadian steel. At the same time as Mark Carney says that he wants a new carbon tax on Canadian steel. By the way, it's not me that says his tax would apply to steel. It's him. In an interview he gave to CTV in Atlantic Canada a month ago, he claimed that taxing steel was a great idea because people, he says, don't use steel anymore.
Now, you think he's kidding? We've got the clip. Now, I've shown this to you before, but I'm glad Poilievre picked up on this.
Large polluters pay. And so what happens...
But does that not ultimately trickle down?
No, because what the big companies are producing, by and large, are not products that we are consuming. There's some element of that, but by and large, you know, a steel company, how much steel are you using these days, Todd? I mean, not as much we used to. So anyway, so no, we're not using any steel. And why it took so long for anybody to notice that, yeah, we use steel. Just have a look in your kitchen. Do you have a refrigerator? Do you have a stove? Do you have a dishwasher? Do you have a car? Do you take a bus? Have you ridden in a train or an airplane lately? Do you work in a skyscraper? This is all steel. Let's get back to Poilievre because he really digs in here.
This building would come crashing down without steel. Automobiles would be impossible to make without steel. Our civilization is, the bones of our civilization is steel. And Mark Carney wants to bring in a big industrial carbon tax on our steel workers at exactly the same time as Trump plans to tariff our steel. The combination of Trump's tariffs and carbon tax, Carney's tax, would destroy our steel sector and threaten our national security.
Okay, well, there's a second part to this. I want to get to this because it's beautiful how he's turned this against Carney. Carney's supposed to be an expert, right? He was a banker. He was a central banker. He was the governor of the Bank of Canada, the governor of the Bank of England, failed in both respects, especially at the Bank of England. And yet he talks about the economy like an eighth grader. I'm kidding you not. We don't use steel anymore. How? When's the last time you used steel? Well, sorry, Mark. Either you're living in a bubble, a vacuum, or liberal land where steel isn't relevant anymore. A little more of this Poilievre interview because I think he's really back in his stride where he needs to be because an election is imminent, and I'll tell you why in a minute.
Pattern for Mr. Carney. He claimed that he helped Paul Martin balance the budget in 1998. Well, Mark Carney wasn't even in the country or working for the government at that time. He didn't join the government as a bureaucrat until 2004. So this is a consistent pattern of Mark Carney lying to the Canadian people. You know what I find interesting about Mark Carney? He doesn't want to take responsibility for the things he actually did, like advising Trudeau for the last 5 years, but he wants to take credit for things he did not do.
You've heard of these people who pad their resume. Well, Mark Carney is that kind of person. As Pierre Poilievre just pointed out, now he's taking credit for Paul Martin balancing the budget. Stephen Harper has said, hey, this guy is misrepresenting himself in his role as governor of the Bank of England while I was prime minister. But Mark Carney, of course, takes credit for everything. But you know, one thing that Poilievre missed in that otherwise very good news conference, the carbon tariff that Mark Carney is so enthused about. And let's listen to this again.
Third thing we're going to do is to ensure that there's fair competition for our companies and that we penalize high polluting foreign imports. So we're going to develop a carbon border adjustment mechanism. What that does is promote jobs here at home. It prevents carbon leakage abroad. And it aligns Canada with our allies who are still engaged in the fight against climate change.
Put that up there again, because you're going to be hearing about this carbon border adjustment mechanism. And most people are going to say, what the hell is that? Well, it's a carbon tariff is what it is. And Mark Carney will be putting that in place in addition to his corporate carbon tax, which the corporations, of course, will offset on you. Of course they will. That's how taxes go. I get taxed as a corporation. Well, I have to charge more. Or we'll find another way to get the tax back out of the consumer. So Carney is pretending he's wiping out the carbon tax as of next week, apparently. And we'll get to that in a minute. But don't be fooled by thinking the carbon tax will disappear if he just offloads it on corporations and has a second carbon tax that's a tariff. Now, this is how this gets really scary, because these corporations that he's going to be taxing to that are going to be passing it on to you or leaving the country. There's going to be an exodus of business from this country as soon as Mark Carney starts implementing his toxic economic program. This is a man whose life has been nothing but toxic. And so that's why we showed you this. Now, so there's madness not just with Mark Carney, but from Canadian politicians as well. And Doug Ford never ceases to amaze me.
A trump card that will instantly change the game. Instantly, when the Americans, and I know the Americans, all of a sudden their gas prices go up 90 to $1 a gallon, they will lose their minds.
Well, apparently Doug Ford has already lost his mind, because this is how this man talks. And of course, he thinks he's got a mandate to punish Donald Trump because he just won this provincial election. Doug Ford has a mandate of some kind. But if he thinks going insane and putting a 25% surcharge in electricity and daring the province of Alberta to do the same is somehow part of his mandate, he is out of his tree. And that is quite clear. And thank God, Danielle Smith, whom was on this program a couple of weeks ago, and she said, what we need is new elections. We need to work with the Americans, not go crazy. And she dropped the bomb. This is very interesting. There are much more effective ways Alberta and Canada can work together to persuade the U.S. to change course on their unjustified and self-defeating tariff strategy against Canada without throwing tens of thousands of Albertans and Canadians out of work. Federal taxes in Alberta energy, Saskatchewan potash, Ontario auto parts, of Quebec aluminum are not the answer. Doug, so will only hurt Canadian workers. I look forward to working with my fellow premiers on implementing much better solutions. No Alberta's thumbs up for an Ottawa tax on oil. It's a thumbs down for gas going to the U.S. I'm 100% with this. I am 100% with this. Now, how is the federal government responding to this? That's very interesting.
He said yesterday that he wanted to get rid of it. We're looking into how that could be done and how rapidly it can be done.
Do you expect this to happen, though, before the election is called?
As I said, we're looking into it. I don't have like a time to give you. We're looking into different options. Do we need to change legislation? Can we go the regulatory route? Like, what are the options? And I don't have an answer for you yet.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, I mean, he said that he wanted, for example, to work on the industrial carbon pricing system that gives us 3 times more emission reduction. So make sure that big polluters do their fair share when it comes to reducing emissions.
I'm a liberal and a proud socialist, Mr. Speaker.
And you should remember that our climate change plan doesn't rest on 1 or 2 measures. It's more than 100 measures that we've deployed.
Third thing we're going to do is to ensure that there's fair competition for our companies, and that we penalize high polluting foreign imports. So we're going to develop a carbon border adjustment mechanism. What that does is promote jobs here at home. It prevents carbon leakage abroad. And it aligns Canada with our allies who are still engaged in the fight against climate change.
Of course, what was Danielle Smith's response?
Even if it holds back our response, even if it holds back one of our biggest pieces of leverage?
Actually, there's no circumstance under which I would agree to another tax on Alberta that takes $40 billion out of Alberta. You can ask me as much as you like. The answer is no.
Yes, and the answer has to be no, because it is chaos. There's no reason we have to destroy the oil and gas industry because Doug Ford is on an ego trip, a massive ego trip. And he is on the way to destroying his province. And God only knows what the response is going to be if he actually follows through on a threat to shut off the power to the United States. But it's worth looking into. Where are we with all of these so-called are we really doing retaliatory tariffs here? This is how the government, the federal government, the Trudeau government, now the Carney government, is describing what Canada is doing. We're retaliating. These are retaliatory tariffs. But 25% surcharge is not a tariff. A tariff is when something's coming into your country, not when you're sending something outside of your country. Now, does Doug Ford even understand that? Now, economics is not his strong point. In fact, very little is his strong point except running in elections. That's what he does best. But let's go through this timeline here, because I was asking myself, what are we retaliating against? Why does Doug Ford want Alberta to put a 25% surcharge on oil and gas exports? That's not a tariff. That's not a retaliatory tariff, because what are we retaliating against? Trump on Wednesday, March the 7th, Trump had temporarily exempted car manufacturers from the 25% tariffs for a month. On Thursday, temporarily exempted goods from Mexico and Canada. This is last Thursday, that are covered by the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Trade Agreement, USMCA, from the 25% tariffs. That deferral will remain in place until April 2nd, Trump announced. Okay. March 12th, 25% tariff on steel and aluminum imports on Canada. That just came in, which are big exporters of these products to the U.S. That, of course, these are the materials that Mark Carney doesn't think we use anymore. Yeah. That this does affect Canada because we do supply the U.S. with most of its aluminum. April 2nd, Trump has threatened to impose a global regime of reciprocal tariffs on all U.S. trading partners. Each country will face the same tariff that it subjects U.S. goods to. Now, have a look at this before I go to the next slide. that's explaining what is actually happening, because the mainstream media won't do it for you. And don't trust the governments, provincial or federal. I would trust Danielle Smith. I didn't agree with throwing out all the liquor, but it's a stunt. She has to do something to look like, to some degree, she's really angry about this. But she's the only sane voice in the room right now. But this is based on a podcast with Conrad Black. I encourage you to listen to this. I didn't have time to clip it all this morning. Conrad Black is saying that Trump is ready, and Black understands Trump like no other Canadian. And not just because he got pardoned by Donald Trump. I can already see the comments. That's because he... Yes, he wrote a great book on Donald Trump, which I reviewed for the Daily Caller, and I interviewed Conrad Black about that book. So, yes, I understand Conrad Black is a huge fan of Donald Trump, but he's also a damn fine journalist. And he understands that Donald Trump is playing a game to some degree here. And he's ready to get this over. So shut up, Doug Ford. Talk like Danielle Smith. Like, we need to get beyond this. We need a new election. We need to elect a new government. That's what we need to do. So let's get to slide 2 here, because this is fascinating stuff. What is the USMCA and how much relief does Canada get? In 2024, Canada's exports to the U.S. were worth about $412.7 billion. Out of these, about $156.9 billion were under the USMCA. This is, and of course, the USMCA is the free trade deal. That's what replaced NAFTA. You remember that? During Trump's last presidency. Hence, Trump's pause applies to 38% of Canada's exports to the United States. Almost all agricultural products traded between the U.S. and Canada fall under the USMCA. Additionally, for Canada, Trump's reprieve also applies to potash fertilizer. The pause does not fully cover energy products on which Trump has imposed a separate 10% tariff. Canada is the biggest source of U.S. oil imports. Finally, let's get to this. What Canada is doing. And this is a semantic game being played by the Trudeau-Carney government and by Doug Ford especially. When Trump first announced the tariff, Canada imposed retaliatory tariffs worth $30 billion on Canadian, or $21 billion on U.S. products. $21 billion U.S. on U.S. products, including orange juice, peanut butter, cosmetics, footwear, and paper products. 2 Canadian officials told the Associated Press on condition of anonymity that these tariffs will remain in place. Canada has 4,400 items under tariff tax you already pay in place. Canada has delayed its second wave of retaliatory tariffs on $125 billion, Canadian dollars, 87.3 billion US worth of US imports until April 2nd. Canadian Finance Minister Dominic LeBlanc wrote in an X post, more Canadian tariff taxes coming on what you pay in grocery stores. Now, get this if you haven't gotten it yet. Counter tariffs, not the surcharges that Doug Ford is talking about and wants Danielle Smith to participate in. Counter tariffs are taxes on you. And I haven't heard Pierre Poilievre say this yet. I've heard Maxime Bernier say this on my show, and he said this quite a few times. He seems to be the only Canadian politician who understands that counter tariffs are taxes on you. It means you pay more in the grocery store. And the more we up the ante, the higher the price gets, because the tariffs increase and increase. It's a recipe for, as I said, a Great Depression with a capital G and a capital D. And this could spread around the entire world if we don't contain it now. This is why we need a new election, and we need people like Danielle Smith who talk rationally, not idiots like Doug Ford who talk irrationally and say a lot of stupid things. Doug Ford, speaking of, the Premier of Canada's the largest province, also said the 25% tariffs on Ontario's electricity, which is supplied to 1.5 million Americans in Minnesota, New York, and Michigan, will remain. A pause on some tariffs means nothing. Until President Trump removes the threat of tariffs for good, we will be relentless, Ford wrote in an X post. So I'm sorry, what does that mean? That means who's the aggressor now in this trade war? Well, Doug Ford and Mark Carney are the aggressors. They want to keep this up. And we heard Mark Carney, and I won't play the speech again, his victory speech, which, by the way, and I've said it before, and I'll say it again, though, it was the same speech he's read to groups of 50 people at coffee shops across the country. But Mark Carney said the same thing. We're going to keep these retaliatory tariffs on. Sorry, Mark Carney doesn't understand what a tariff is either. And Mark Carney doesn't understand that if he wants this trade war to end, why is he the aggressive one? Canada has become the aggressive one because that's the only way the Liberal Party can win. And I'm not going to go in on length about this. I've said it before. I'll say it again. The only way the Liberal Party can win the next federal election is by running against Donald Trump and the U.S., not against Pierre Poilievre and the Conservative Party of Canada. And that's been the game plan for 4 months or 3 months. They're sticking to that. Now, when I hear Stephen Guilbeault, remember Stephen Guilbeault? He's the guy that climbed the CN Tower for Greenpeace. He's the guy that said, never am I ever going to consider eliminating the carbon tax. But there he is. We saw him. You bet immediately. Yes, sir. We're going to get rid of that carbon tax. And it's going to be a corporate carbon tax. We won't say it too loudly because that way people think we're really eliminating the carbon tax. And that's how Mark Carney is going to run in the next election. He's going to run sooner rather than later. I've just heard while I was on the broadcast, somebody notified me the Conservative Party is issuing lawn signs. They think an election is imminent. I think so too. And I'll tell you why. Because Mark Carney is promising to get rid of the personal carbon tax. Guess when that personal carbon tax was scheduled to be implemented? The next phase, 21 more cents a liter. April 1st. So Mark Carney is going to go to you and say, hey, this can't be an axe to tax election. I got rid of the carbon tax. I've offset it on those evil corporations. They're going to pay for it, not you. And as Pierre Poilievre said, that is balderdash. You will end up paying for it, and you'll end up paying for Carney's carbon tariff. That's what's going to happen. But Carney's going to run on that. He's looking at the polls, and I've shown those to you. Ecos poll saying a Liberal Party under Mark Carney could win a majority government. I think that's absolute nonsense. That's absolute rubbish. But Mark Carney is going to grab that, and he's going to be showing that poll to people and saying, hey, look, I'm going to get a majority government. People love me. The longer Mark Carney stays around as the caretaker prime minister of a caretaker government, the worse he looks to Canadians. So yes, he'll run sooner rather than later, unless he decides to impose emergency powers like he's already threatened to do, to rule by decree for another year and a half. Could happen too. But I think he's going to go for the election. And every indication I'm hearing suggests that that's what he'll do. Mark Carney is a sneaky man. I agree with Pierre Poilievre on that completely. He's sneaky, he's hypocritical, he's evasive, and he's also invasive. He's advocated for digital currency in the past. He wants to neutralize the United States dollar. This is a man who is a globalist emissary, replacing another globalist emissary, Justin Trudeau. Mark Carney is a clear and present danger to Canada as well as the United States. And I hope Donald Trump wakes up to this fact. The longer Carney stays in power, the worse it's going to be for the world. Donald Trump needs to encourage an election in Canada and to stop coming between Canada and that election. And that's what needs to happen very soon. I'll be back with some concluding remarks. Thanks for watching today. I'm back tomorrow with Lisa McDonald. She's a counselor from Pickering, Ontario. She has had hell on earth from a woke, politically correct council, and her story is fascinating. I met her at an event in Ottawa about a year and a half ago that Christine Anderson spoke at, and I spoke at the event too, as well as Lisa. It's going to be fascinating to talk to her, and we might have some other material to go through as well. But join me again tomorrow. I'll be back with all the news you need to know, and let's continue to resolve to resist.